now to a few more questions, maybe the final question. And that is, I think, Helena, you mentioned domestic contracts like cohabitation agreements or for married couples, they would, I mean, that context is the prenup. Are there things that you cannot contract out of?
Well, so what we're talking about are agreements that people make because they're planning on moving in to live together or shortly after they have moved in to live together.
Yeah.
And those are called things like living together agreements or cohabitation agreements, depending on your linguistic preference and perhaps also the province in which you happen to reside. Um, when people that want these agreements in place usually come in one of two forms. They are bringing substantial amount of assets into the relationship, or sometimes substantial amount of debts. On the once bitten, twice shy theory, they've been through a messy breakdown, don't want to do that again, right?
Right.
And so what these agreements try to do is that by and large, they're intended to try to plan for and anticipate the legal problems that might come up in the event the relationship ends, right? Some people might also have cohabitation or prenuptial agreements that also talk about how the relationship is going to be managed. But that, quite frankly, is the exception rather than the rule. But sometimes people will want that kind of a term of an agreement. And it might be things like, if you incur debt, it's not going to be in my name, it's only going to be in your name. And if we buy a new refrigerator, we're both going to pay 50% of the purchase cost and, stuff like that. But these agreements, generally speaking, have a kind of limited utility, right? What they're good for is talking about property rights or possibly property disentitlement. They're good for talking about debt and things like that. Sometimes they're good about talking about spousal support. Now, as you can imagine, most people who are wanting a cohabitation agreement don't want to have to pay spousal support. So they sign a contract that says, in the event our relationship ends, neither of us will have any entitlement or obligation to pay spousal support to the other. The problem with all that is that cohabitation agreements, just like marriage agreements, are like peering into a crystal ball. Right? Like you, Heather, you can probably tell me with a fair degree of certainty where you're going to be this time next year, but you can't tell me anything with any certainty about where you're going to be 5 years from now or 10 years from now. And it's the same thing about a cohab agreement, because you don't know, whether or if or when your relationship is going to come to an end. And the problem with that is that your circumstances might change dramatically between the time you sign the agreement and the time the relationship goes belly up. So let's say you're healthy, hale, and hearty when you sign the cohab agreement, and right then and there, you're young, you have your entire career ahead of you, and sure, I don't mind waiving my right to spousal support. That sounds great.
Right.
But then you have a child, and the two of you make the decision that you're going to stay home. So you abandon your career and become a homemaker for several years, and then your relationship breaks up. The problem is that your ability to return to the workforce is going to be significantly hampered by the time you took off. You can't go back to your old job. Somebody else is filling that job. If you do go back to your old career, you're going to have to start several rungs down because you're no longer kept current. You don't have that space on your resume nicely filled.
Right.
Or to take a more grim example, what if you get hit by a bus or come down with something god awful like multiple sclerosis, right? And so so you can try to fend off questions about spousal support, crossing your fingers and hoping that everything continues in your relationship as it should. But it's difficult because you're always subject to, the sands of time and the things that may and may not happen. There are a couple of things, though, that you can't effectively deal with in any kind of pre-marriage or cohabitation agreement. And those really have to do with children and with child support. An agreement to waive an entitlement for child support will never be valid and will never be upheld by any court in Canada. You're always going to have to pay. And even if you said, well, I'll pay, but only this amount, well, the court's not going to hold that up either, right? And that's primarily because child support is the right of the child. And because it's the child's right, not yours, you don't have standing to give away a right that doesn't belong to you. The other thing is stuff about parenting arrangements. I mean, I can imagine somebody saying, well, in the event that we separate, I want, sole custody of our kids or something like that. But again, sands of time, it's going to be impossible to say what parenting arrangement will be in the child's best interests at some point in the future in the unlikely event or the likely event that you separate. So So really what we're talking about are agreements that are good sometimes for managing how relationships run. We're not talking about who takes out the garbage and who does the laundry. We're talking about stuff like, how do you buy things and how do you manage debt and things like that. They're also effective for managing the distribution of property and property rights at the end of a relationship. And they're sometimes effective in dealing with spousal support, sometimes, depending, but that's about it.
That's okay. So I'm here. Here's a big but that I'm thinking of right now. Can't the couple renegotiate this agreement? Say, several years into their relationship, they can always
Oh, yeah.
revisit it. And because I think, as you said, that's right. No one knows what life is going to be like 5 years from now. So how about maybe 5 years later they revisit the agreement and they change any terms that they find are no longer really applicable? I mean, is that wise?
Well, no, well, hell, do that. Like the thing about contracts is that they're agreements, right?
Yeah.
And as long as you agree to change your agreement, well, go ahead and do it. There's nothing stopping you from doing that.
Right.
The problem is that once people settle into a groove into their relationship and they get used to how things go, very few people ever actually remember, oh yeah, the agreement said we had to talk about spousal support again in 5 years. Hardly anybody ever does that, right? And frankly, I mean, if you're getting on well and like a house on fire and the end of your relationship is not imminently foreseeable, most people just don't worry about it. So, but yeah, I mean, what you're saying, Heather, is true. Sure, if you want to do that, you absolutely can. Go for it.
Yeah. And again, the other cautionary thing to keep in mind, and this is not just a plug for lawyers because we all want the business and there's tons of money to be made in this, is that, well, for starters in Ontario, our terminology is that we have domestic contracts,
right,
which takes into the basket everything that has to do with prenups, cohabitation agreements, marriage contracts, whatever, or if it's specifically just dealing with a child. And this is quite often in a situation if the parties aren't living together, and then they're called paternity agreements. So we use the phrases domestic contracts and paternity agreements. And a domestic contract can talk sometimes about kids, but as JP said, you cannot in advance set out who is going to have the care of a child and what the other parent's visitation rights are going to be and what the support is going to be in any kind of a domestic contract anywhere, including in Ontario. But the big thing to keep in mind that these are, and we're talking agreements, but legally they are contracts. And in order to be legally binding and enforceable, in the event there is a breakdown of the relationship, your agreement has to meet all the requirements that are there in order to be enforceable. So what we used to call like kitchen table agreements, where a couple sat down and drafted up something on their own, is lovely, but it's not going to be legally enforceable down the road. And again, the other thing to keep in mind is that a lot of people do these when they're coming into a relationship because they're bringing in assets that they want to protect. That might be like family businesses are a big thing that quite often form the basis of a marriage contract to say, okay, we're going to kind of opt out of the provincial property regime that's in effect in Ontario or BC or Alberta. And this is what we are going to say happens in the event our relationship breaks down. Quite often what lawyers will tell people that are debating whether they do want to enter into a premarital agreement, like one that's being done in anticipation or contemplation of marriage or shortly after marriage, is that generally, I don't think it's a bad idea to sit down and play what if with your partner to say, because you don't know where the future is going to go. And always what I have done when trying to encourage people, it's maybe time to think about this and at least do broad strokes and figure out what you want to do. It's an awful lot better and easier to figure out what you should be doing as a couple to be fair to each other when you're still in love and you really, really like each other and you don't want to hurt each other.
right.
Than to not have something in place and then just take the blows as they come when you're separated and very, very angry. So you're liable to come up with something that's a lot fairer to both parties if you do it when you still like each other. But subject to the caveat that it has to be done properly, has to meet all the requirements because it is a legal contract. And then it's something that should be reviewed because circumstances are going to change.
So on the subject, though, of talking to your partner about what needs to be in this, let me just sort of say one additional thing to what I said before. Remember when I was talking about how relationships can sometimes, or relationship agreements can sometimes talk about how the relationship itself is going to be managed? Throughout this entire conversation, we've been talking about people involved in pair relationships, right? And that's fair enough because under the law of Canada, you can only have, one other married spouse other than yourself. But the reality is that in Canada, all across Canada, multi-adult relationships are increasing. These are called polyamorous relationships. And the thing that polyamorous families need to be aware of is that in many jurisdictions, like Alberta, for example, there is a numerical cap on the number of people you can have who qualify in Alberta as your adult interdependent partner. But in places like British Columbia, there's no numerical cap on how many other unmarried spouses you can have. Have as many as you like, fill your boots. The problem, though, is that individuals entering in this kind of relationship are kind of, in most provinces outside of British Columbia, they're living in kind of a legal netherland, right? Where it's not quite sure exactly how weird questions like spousal support are going to work, even when one party of a multi-adult relationship is clearly entitled to support because of the circumstances of the relationship. But apart from those legal sort of ambiguities, what I was saying before about how not very many people sign agreements that deal with how relationships are managed, that's true, except when we talk about polyamorous families. In a case like that, it can be critically important to have deep, long, painful, and introspective conversations with all of your partners about not just what's going to happen in the event the relationship ends, but about how the relationship will be managed. If you acquire property, how will all of you do it? Will just one person own it? Will somebody else be required to kick into the cost? If you incur debt, will debts be managed on a strictly per individual kind of basis, or will there be any sharing involved? But you have to think about a whole range of other, sometimes uncomfortable questions about things like, is it okay to see other people? What if we want to add someone to our relationship? What if somebody wants to leave our relationship while the rest of us continue in the relationship? And so, or are we going to have children? If so, who are the probable parents going to be? And if we do decide to have children, will we use artificial reproduction in order to maximize the number of parents who are under our roof? In British Columbia, for example, the Family Law Act lets people who are conceiving a child with assisted reproduction have as many as 6 people who are legal parents to that child for all purposes of the law. So what we're talking about here when we're talking about cohab agreements and marriage agreements, the entire conversation has been in very broad strokes about people in dyadic relationships, pair relationships. But a lot of this stuff doesn't apply and shouldn't apply to people who are in or planning on being in a multi-adult relationship. In a case like that, it is even more important that you speak to a lawyer in your neighborhood.
And again, in Ontario, those relationships aren't even recognized. We felt we came a long ways when they actually agreed that you could have a marriage occur between people of the same sex. So
Right.
now when we talk about spouse, it doesn't have to be one man and one woman. It can be any combination thereof, but there can only be 2. So any kind of polyamorous relationships are not recognized in Ontario law.
Yep. It doesn't mean that they don't exist. It just means that under the law, they don't have rights. So in Alberta, you can be married to one other person, but you cannot be married to somebody and have an adult interdependent partner. And if you are an adult interdependent partner of someone, you can't have more than one adult interdependent partner. So the rules all change depending on where you live. But even if you are in Alberta in a polyamorous relationship, it doesn't mean that you're suddenly exempt from child support obligations. It doesn't mean that you suddenly have no rights as a guardian of the child, but there are other issues involved, especially when we talk about rights involving spousal support and the division of property. And even though in Alberta, they've recently extended property rights to unmarried long-term relationships, you can't assume that they're going to apply to you if you happen to live in an unmarried long-term polyamorous relationship. So when Helena talks about them not being recognized, it means there's no provision built in for that kind of relationship in the law.
And again, probably the one good takeaway to keep is that when you're talking about children, pretty well every regime across Canada dealing with family law and with what happens with parenting and child support is that the founding basis of everything that we do, no matter which province you are in, is what is in the best interests of the child. And we're talking about the child's rights. Again, sometimes even when you're talking with a traditional heterosexual marriage, parenting rights are actually more along the lines of obligations, because the way the courts are going more and more and more is leaning towards confirming that it is the right of a child to be parented in the best way possible and to be supported to the best of the parent's ability and their ability to pay.
So even
Agreed.
when people talk about child support, that's still viewed as a child's right.
It is. That's why a parent cannot bargain away the child's right to support. That the state has acknowledged that is a right of a child, and the parents can't bargain it away in advance or do it to cut a deal to get a better break on property. The court won't allow it.
It is not viewed as the child's right. It is the child's right.
It is the child's right. Okay. Okay. One minor sort of mind question, because Helena, I think you were mentioning about the make sure you do it properly when you're doing the domestic contract and so on. Otherwise, it's not legally enforced. So, you know, in wills, you know how you need like 2 witnesses and things like that. Is it the same for
On the province where you live.
Oh, again, that that depends on the province. Okay. So there you go. Okay. So that's
Generally, what I can tell you, if it's the 2 of you sitting down at a kitchen table and writing it out without legal advice or anybody witnessing your signatures, it's a nice piece of paper, but
But on the other hand, would be eminently enforceable in British Columbia and Alberta and in other provinces. It all depends on the province in which you live. And if there's any message to take away from this, it should have been about the fact that you cannot be absolutely certain that the rights involved in being in an unmarried long-term relationship are the same or even close to the rights that are involved in being in a married relationship. The other thing you have to take away is that the steps you have to take, the status to have the status of being an unmarried partner, depending on the province that you live in, is also going to change. So what's critically important is to check the laws that apply to you in your particular jurisdiction. I can't emphasize that enough.
Helena, do you have any last words?
no, I think that was pretty well it. And now there is a plethora of good advice that's out there. But again, if you are researching it yourself rather than starting with a lawyer to get your legal advice from on these issues, depending on which province you're in, make sure you're dealing with a reliable online source. And we've mentioned a few of them. And Heather, as you said, you will be posting those up and making them available to anybody that's watching. So that's great.
Really important point that comes from that. You can find at Chapters and Staples and London Drugs and the corner store little do-it-yourself cohabitation kits.
Yeah.
I appreciate that you can buy access to justice for $30 plus GST and PST. That's awesome.
Right.
But the takeaway from Helena's conversation should be that there are specific legal tests that have to be met to have a valid agreement in that province. There are other different tests that apply in different provinces. The rights that you may or may not have as somebody who's in a long-term unmarried relationship change hugely as you travel from province to province within Canada. I would humbly suggest that you perhaps consider not just simply filling out one of the, drugstore do-it-yourself cohabitation agreements. It is worth your time to spend $500 now getting legal advice from a lawyer rather than spending $50,000 down the road dealing with a lousy agreement at trial.
And Heather, just to top it off, when you were talking about wills and estates, I think it's a great topic for another day. A lot of the same issues we've been talking about. But for, I think, over 2 centuries, the toast of the Litigation Society in London, England, here's to the testator that writes his own will, because it's kept a lot of lawyers and a lot of work for a lot of years.
Well, I was just going to add one final thing before we say goodbye, is that the drugstore version, I would say sometimes perhaps a person could buy it just to see what kinds of topics or what kinds of questions pop up. Because sometimes you don't even know what to ask. Like you might, I think that I've had that happen to me when, you go to a lawyer's office and you're so intimidated by the lawyer and you're like, I don't know, whatever you say, but if you go spend the $30 and you look at, what are some of the suggested clauses that they include in these kits, and then you might, consult with your lawyer. Well, would that be good in my situation? I mean, maybe like the kits are a good starting point, like you said, I agree, but don't completely rely on it.
Or another place to go, again, on the Steps to Justice website, they actually have, again, a very, very good walkthrough on, and the page is actually called, I believe, Division of Property upon Separation or the Death of a Spouse. And it'll actually walk you through a bunch of questions that you have to answer about what you own, what your partner owns, when it was purchased, what debts do you have. And based on the information that's provided in your answers, it would start formatting things that are flagged that you are going to have to look at and consider.
Just, do you guys have any online free resources that you recommend that people go for information on this area?
Well, if you happen to live in British Columbia, you can go to my public legal education resource, which is called JP Boyd on Family Law, and it's hosted by Courthouse Libraries, British Columbia. In Alberta, the organization that you want to look for is called the Centre for Public Legal Education Alberta, or CPLEA. They have a variety of fairly top quality legal information kits available online that specifically relate to family matters. And Helena, in Ontario, you're blessed with a number of really top drawer organizations.
We do. Probably one of the biggest heavy hitters on the scene now for being out there as a resource for people who are trying to figure out their legal rights and obligations in family law is Steps to Justice, which is an amazing website that was created in a partnership between Community Legal Education Ontario. I'm just looking at the list here to make sure I don't miss anybody. Ministry of the Attorney General for the Province of Ontario, Legal Aid Ontario, the Law Society of Ontario, both levels of court in Ontario, the Superior Court of Justice and the Provincial Court of Justice, and the Action Group on Access to Justice, as well as my project, the Family Law Limited Scope Services Project. They have an excellent webpage on the legal differences between marriage and cohabitation and how they apply. But again, it's an Ontario-specific resource. Again, even if you just Google the difference between marriage and separation or rights on separation, again, if you're Googling it, which most people are going to be doing these days, my only caveat is to make sure you look at the jurisdiction you're reading where the information is coming from. There's a lot out there. If you're looking for it and it's coming from a reputable source, they are good. In Ontario, my first place to send people to look for information is usually to the Steps to Justice website.
Sounds good. So again, for everyone,
general,
I will have the links below. So John Paul, go ahead.
So I was just going to say that in general, legal aid organizations, provincial legal aid organizations, usually provide some quality legal information about family law matters and the difference between married and unmarried relationships, but not all. For example, Alberta's Legal Aid Society doesn't have a mandate for public legal education, and as a consequence, they don't provide any. But on the other hand, British Columbia Legal Aid and Nova Scotia Legal Aid both have abundant resources available online that are of a uniformly high quality.
Great, super. Okay, so again, for our audience, I will have links to these resources that our speakers have just mentioned in the description below. On that note, I want to thank you both for being here today. Well, thank you very much. That was really, really interesting and informative. Definitely, I didn't know this coming in. And I want to thank our viewers for watching. And again, I will provide the links to the resources that our speakers have mentioned. And I thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you at the next video. Bye.
Thanks, Heather. That was fun. Nice talking to you, JP. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.